Okay, so this is the third video lecture, and we are in the third chapter, Forming a New Life. We've got some more genetic terms. We last were talking about how you get half your genes from your mom and half of your genes from your dad. So half are on the X and half are on the Y, or half are on the, anyway. And all traits require basically half of that information is on one and half of the other is on the other. These are what we call alleles, right? So on each allele, you'll get a signal or you'll get a message, and there may be a slightly different message on the other. When both of them are the same, we would call that homogeneous, right? When they're different, they're heterogeneous. When they're different, this is where things kind of get interesting. If you've ever heard of the idea of a dominant trait or a dominant gene versus a recessive, dominant, I guess one way to kind of think about them is it's like a capital letter. So if you have a capital letter allele on one, then that means that one is that's the one that's going to present, or that's the one that's going to be part of the phenotype. So the genotype is all the letters, and a phenotype is what it looks like. If you see the word pH down here on the bottom of this list, if you think of it like a photo, right? So when they're different, and one of them is capital, that's the one that presents, that's what we would call a dominant inheritance. Sometimes though, you don't get any capital letters, and instead you get two lowercase letters, and that's what we call recessive. In order for a recessive trait to present, you have to get two of them. For instance, like blue eyes and light color hair, those are recessive traits. If you get a blue eye trait from your mom, but a brown eye trait from your dad, those are actually going to be brown, because brown is a capital letter or a dominant, and blue is a recessive trait. Same thing with like light complexion, light hair, blue-eyed, light-skinned people have more recessive traits. A polygenetic means you have to have a whole bunch of them in order for them to present, in order for them to show up. Complexion is usually considered a polygenetic, like it's not just a matter of one set of alleles doesn't make, but that's where it kind of gets confusing, because it's also considered a genetic mutation or a genetic evolution in response to environment. In other words, like light complected people came from the part of the world, the northern part of the world where it was colder, and darker complected people came from the equator where it's hotter and there was more sunshine. As a way that the complexion modified itself or mutated in response to protecting itself from the UV. And lighter complexion absorbs more vitamin D, so people who are from the part of the world where there was less sunlight, who spent less time outside, needed to absorb that sunlight through their lighter skin. Multifactorial transmission. This is a kind of a fancy way to, it really just means you have to have, so skin complexion is really one of these two. It's a multi-factor transmission. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This one means that the environment. That's right. So this is another fancy way of talking about the environment genetic correlation, how those things appear together, and then, or how one influences another, otherwise kind of known as that epigenetics kind of thing. Then you got the phenotype and the genotype, which we've already talked about. The next slide on here then is pretty much more of the same ideas. I have talked about some of these, but these are illustrations of these sex-linked inheritance ideas. Keeping in mind, so now you got some images here to think about, but you have the X gene is bigger and there's more space for material. The Y gene is smaller. So if you have so that would be a normal allele, and then a defective allele. So the example that is depicted up here at this very top one, I don't know if you can actually see where my cursor goes. Maybe you can. This one right here is you have this normal X allele from your mother, but your mother also has a defective X allele, but it doesn't present because the normal one overrides the defective one. But she could have, when she has children and she passes on her X and her X to her girls, she could pass on her normal allele to her girl. And you'll notice this man over here, he only has a normal allele and his little bitty Y. So he passes on his normal X with his partner's normal X, and you have normal vision. Now, another scenario would be he passes on his normal X, and she passes on her defective X. And what's this one? This one means you are a colorblind carrier because you have the other X to back it up. However, if they have a boy, if she has a male, she'll pass on one of her X's, either the good one or the bad one. He will only pass on his Y. So it's all going to depend on her, right? If she passes on her normal X, he will have normal vision. If, however, she passes on her defective X to her son, who will get the Y from his father, then the child has color blindness. I hope, since I'm probably talking pretty fast, I hope you can look at these images and get a better idea of what I'm saying about. This is what we would call sex-linked inheritance. And this is a quiz question. I believe I actually ask you to explain it as if you were explaining it to a child. And the question is, why are women less likely to present color blindness, conditions like color blindness and baldness? And the answer is because the colorblind trait, if it's on one of her X's, she has another X to back it up. If, however, he does not, so if he inherits her colorblind trait, he does not have another X to back it up. So she has two X's and she's got a backup if there's something wrong. He has one X, he don't got no backup X if there's something wrong. That's basically the answer to the question. Some other things that can kind of go amok or are not necessarily, I hate to use the word normal, but are not normal in terms of sex-linked traits so remember we talked about girls are XX and boys are XY, but there's some other varieties that can show up in nature. And I teach my sociology class. I often talk about, how many sexes are there when we talk about X and Y. And here's some of the answers. There are some less common abnormalities that you have one X and two Y, XYY. Sometimes it can be triple X, XXX. There's also an X and an O with the Turner syndrome. And these are all variations. So here are some images of what these physical traits look like. Now, it is worth pointing out, because as reluctant as I am to use the term abnormal, it is worth pointing out that that it's not uncommon for people who have these conditions also to be infertile. So that does seem like something that is you're supposed to be fertile. Here's just some other examples down here of the XY, XX. And then there's a condition called Fragile X, which I am only moderately familiar with. This image up here is supposed to, I meant to look up before I gave this lecture what fragile meant. Some other conditions that are on the sex-linked traits are cleft palate. That's where the palate doesn't completely fuse during development. Cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell is kind of an interesting one. It is a sex-linked trait. My understanding is it's more likely to present in men, black men, but it is also thought to be an evolutionary adaptation to people who grew up or who are from parts of the world where there's a lot of malaria, because people who get malaria and have sickle cell are more likely to survive than people who do not have sickle cell. Yes, that's right. So it is evolutionarily advantageous if you live in a part of the world where there is more sickle cell to have more. If you're from a part of the world where there's more malaria, it's advantageous for you to have sickle cell. Yeah, that's pretty much what that means. These last couple slides, it looks like there's 2 or 3 of them left, are about the process of development once the egg and the sperm have met. Now remember, once the egg and the sperm have met, now you have a single cell, and we call that a zygote, right? Between up until about 2 weeks, so the zygote divides. Somewhere in here, it bumbles its way down the fallopian tubes, and it embeds itself inside the uterine wall that has thickened. This is what happens during a woman's cycle. It is thickened. It is full of blood and nutrients, and as it implants itself, then it begins to further develop. Only about 10 to 20%, this to me is remarkable, only about 10 to 20% of eggs reach this stage of development. Okay, I'm going to stop right here because I'm getting up to my 10-minute mark.